20th century consisted of breakthroughs that changed the ways of the Western world. Such drastic changes were reflected in the period's literature. In this section, we'll discuss the timeline of events that influenced the way literature was written. The Edwardians. The 20th century opened up with the expectation that science and technology would transform the world in the century ahead. Such ideals were reflected in H.G. Wells' studies, anticipations of the reaction of mechanical and scientific progress upon human life and thought in 1901, and a modern utopia in 1905. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901, however, changed such expectations to a more realistic one. Many Edwardian novelists were eager to explore the shortcomings of English social life reflected in works such as The History of Mr. Polly in 1910, Man of Property in 1906, Where Angels Fear to Tread in 1905, and The Longest Journey in 1907. Nevertheless, even as they perceived the difficulties of the present, most novelists believed that constructive change would advance through their writing. Some novelists such as Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton, and Edward Thomas were not so confident about the future and advocated towards the revival of traditional forms such as ballads, narrative poems, satire, fantasy, topographical poems, and essays. The most significant writing of the period was brought by the pessimistic expectation that the new century would witness a collapse of a whole civilization once the South African War began. Literature during this time would question the human cost of empire building. Such depictions of imperial civilization were expertly depicted by American novelist Henry James with his works such as The Wings of the Dove in 1902 and The Golden Bowl in 1904. Another expert novelist was Joseph Conrad, who shared James's sense of crisis but attributed it less to the decline of a specific civilization than to human failings. Such a notion would be reflected in his works, namely The Secret Agent in 1904 and Under Western Eyes in 1907. Anglo-American Modernism. From 1908 to 1914, there was a remarkably productive period of innovation and experiment. Novelists challenged literary conventions of the entire post-Romantic era. The spirit of modernism was reflected in works such as Ripote in 1912 and De Magiste in 1914. Poets such as T.E. Hume, F.S. Flint, Richard Aldington, Hilda Doolittle, and Amy Lowell rose to fame. Authors during this time wanted to refine the language of poetry in order for it to depict the exact description of mood. The first period of the modernist revolution ended once World War I began. The event made novelists shift their utopian impulse to something that reflected the present situation brought by the war. Works were then written with a note of anguish, immensity, and horror of the war. Principal figures of this style were Pound, Wyndham Lewis, D.H. Lawrence, and T.S. Eliot.
Here we'll be tackling the major themes of the 20th century British literature. The poetry of the First World War and the literature flourished in the period in the post-World War II era, influencing new interests and approaches in British literature. Another historical or social influence on the themes in literature would be the change in England's role in the world. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, England was a dominating world power with its strong sense of imperialism and its establishment of colonies and political influence all across the world. These literary works would often be described as unsettling, disruptive, and political. Now, let's go to the major themes. First is modernism. Imagism was a subgenre of modernism, concerned with creating clear imagery and experience of an object using words. Modernist writers broke free of old forms and techniques. They abandoned traditional rhyme schemes and wrote in free verse. Writers entered experimentation, creating new styles, themes, and forms, such as the birth of Imagism. Next is corruption. Common topics of post-war British literature were civil war, government, use of technology, and forms of oppression. Some of the most notable works of fiction of the 20th century could take place against a political backdrop. It included the themes of imperialism and how war survivors adapted to the changing world. Next is ambiguity. Ambiguity occurs when something is open to more than one interpretation. Although this technique was popularized by William Shakespeare in the 1500s, writers would still often use ambiguous characters that are not simply heroes or villains in their works. They fall somewhere in between and as such add a layer of depth, complexity, and uncertainty in the story. Last is nationalism. Literature helped writers to express nationalist ideas particularly well to heighten people's awareness. Writers need to speak, and literature gives them a voice to just do that. The influence of early 1900s British literature is still vast to this day. Though the process of decolonization had begun, the effects of British dominance would last in literature and poetry for decades to come.
Now, we move to the representative authors and their works in 20th century British literature. For poetry, first, we have William Butler Yeats, who is an Irish poet, dramatist, and prose writer from Dublin, Ireland. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1923. He also founded the Rhymers Club Poetry Group in 1890 and joined the Order of the Golden Dawn, an organization that expounded on subjects related to the occult and mysticism. At first, he was characterized by a self-conscious romanticism, and his poetry includes Irish myth and folklore that has a mystical, dreamlike quality to them. He wanted to contribute to his Irish culture with his own distinctive style in structure and imagery. Yeats' poetry also consists of symbolisms rooted in old legends, occult studies, automatic writing, and prophetic dreams. His poem The Stolen Child in 1886 explores the loss of innocence. It is rooted in Irish mythology. Yeats used a Celtic legend about fairies stealing children and replacing them with changelings. He used the fairies and island as a symbol for freedom that shows his dissatisfaction in modern society. He then committed to Irish nationalism, wherein his poetry became more public and about the politics of the modern Irish state. Like in his poem, The Second Coming, written in 1919, it presents the world without hope and order, stating that anarchy was loosened upon the world. It prophesied the impending second coming of Jesus Christ due to the anarchy in the world, especially after the events of World War I. Next, we have T.S. Eliot. He is an American-British poet, playwright, critic, and editor who won the Order of Merit and Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948. He experimented in diction, style, and verse, and he reanimated English poetry, as well as criticized old orthodoxies in his essays and created new ones. His poetry includes literary history, wherein he would allude to myths and canons and the perception of the modern world as alienated and fractured considering the aftermath of the war. He termed the mythic method that he attributed to Yeats as the first one to have been conscious of it. The mythic method is used to compare the situation of the past to the present to see what has been lost. He also uses allusions and fragmentations, like in his poem The Wasteland in 1922. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a form of dramatic monologue which is similar to soliloquies. He enforced fragmentation, allusion, imagery, and juxtaposition in this poem. It's about a sexually frustrated and anxious man expressing his musings toward a romantic interest. On the other hand, For Quartets is Eliot's last famous work, which is a set of 4 poems that explore the nature of time, religion, and the historical present and past.
Then we have here Winston U. Auden, a British poet, author, playwright, and critic from Yorkshire, England. He bagged awards such as Pulitzer Prize in 1948 in his work The Age of Anxiety, a Baroque Eclogue. Then a National Book Awards under the category of poetry in 1953 in his work The Shield of Achilles. In that same year, he won the Bollingen Prize in Poetry. Auden intended to be a mining engineer and was interested primarily in science, so he specialized in biology. However, by 1922, he had discovered his vocation as a poet. Auden achieved his early fame in the 1930s when he stood as a hero during the Great Depression. Continuing the analysis of the evils in capitalist society, he also warned the rise of totalitarianism. Auden Group was founded dedicated to revolutionary politics and was largely a journalistic invention. He established his reputation as a poet and sage in 1930 in his work Paid on Both Sides, a charade along with poems. He collaborated with Christopher Isherwood in most of his verse dramas. Auden went to Berlin when he had an opportunity after he graduated from Oxford in 1928. He fell in love with the German language and it influenced his poetry, cabaret songs, and plays, especially those with Bertolt Brecht. Auden's works were inspired from the Icelandic sagas, Old English poetry, public school stories, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and other psychologists and schoolboy humor. For Auden, poetry is a therapy, performing a function somehow analogous to the psychoanalytical. The characteristics of his poems are uneven and often obscure. Some are related to fantasy, mythic, and unconscious. Not to mention, he also tackles the ills of society and the psychological and moral defects of the individuals. As Auden's legacy, his poetry was more relevant to contemporary social and political realities than T.S. Eliot and William Butler Yeats.
Virginia Woolf is a novelist, essayist, and biographist who is known for her contributions to 20th century literature and her essays that influenced feminist criticism. She is a member of the Bloomsbury Group or Bloomsbury Set, which is a circle of writers and intellectuals who sought freedom to develop their own ideas and lifestyles. Woolf is known for her use of the stream of consciousness techniques in her novels. It aims to capture the thought process of the characters in all its chaos that involves unconventional language use. It does not follow the rules of grammar and syntax. It can be nonlinear or illogical, and repetition can be used for emphasis. Also, her use of symbolisms and poetic style are eminent in her works. She uses allusions and images, rhythms, refrains, and metaphors that make her writings poetic. She used the stream of consciousness technique in Mrs. Dalloway, wherein she was able to show what the characters are thinking, that created a continuity between the minds of the characters and between the past and present time. She also used it in her other novels To the Lighthouse and The Waves, with the incorporation of symbolisms and other poetic devices. Apart from that, Woolf is known for her contributions to the beginning of feminist criticism. Her essay, A Room of One's Own, discusses the status of women in writing, that the financial and educational disadvantages experienced by women deprive them of their own creative expression. Hence, women need money and their own room be able to write.
Next on the line, we have James Augustine Aloysius Joyce, or simply James Joyce. He is an Irish author of poems, novels, and play from Dublin, Ireland. He is known for his experimental use of language and exploration of new literary methods. He is also one of the major figures of literary modernism and among the most commanding influences on novelists of the 20th century. He entered University College in Dublin. There he studied languages and read books that are not recommended by the Jesuit. James Joyce also took an active part in the college's literary and historical society. He greatly admired Henrik Ibsen. He learned Dano-Norwegian to read the original and had an article, Ibsen's new drama, a review of the play When We Dead Awaken, published in the London Fortnightly Review in 1900, just after his 18th birthday. This early success confirmed Joyce in his resolution to become a writer. He never stops mastering the art of writing. He wrote verses and experimented with short prose passages that he called epiphanies, accounts of moments when the real truth about some person or object was revealed. His famous works are Dubliners, a portrait of the artist as a young man, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake. After James Joyce, we have here George Bernard Shaw, an Irish comic dramatist, literary critic, and socialist propagandist, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929 in his play Saint John, which performed in year 1923, and Academy Award in 1939 in his play Pygmalion, performed in 1913. He pioneered the Fabian Society in year 1884. Fabian Society is a socialist society in London. Its goal is to establish a democratic socialist state in Great Britain. The Fabians believe in evolutionary socialism rather than in revolution. Shaw developed his wide knowledge of music, art, and literature through his mother's influence and his visits to the National Gallery of Ireland. Shaw experienced failures in his first published works, such as Immaturity in 1879, published in 1930, and an unfinished novel in 1958, but originally written in year 1887 to 1888. Then William Archer found Shaw's journalistic capacity. Shaw wrote book reviews in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1885 to 1888 and art criticism in the World in year 1886 to 1889. Shaw's plays genre are romantic comedy, raising religious consciousness and societal issues. In the latter part of his career, he explored tragicomic and non-realistic symbolism. He published countless plays that gave him a reputation as the best comic dramatist of his time and most significant playwrights in the English language since the 17th century. Shaw was also the most trenchant pamphleteer, the most readable music critic in English, the best theater critic of his generation, a prodigious lecturer and essayist on politics, economics, and sociological subjects, and one of the most prolific letter writers in literature. Shaw helped mold the political, economic, and sociological thought of 3 generations.
After Shaw comes an experimental Irish playwright named Samuel Barclay Beckett, who is also a novelist and a critic. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969 and even was elected as P.O.S. Donna, which is the highest honor bestowed by an association of Irish creatives. He is also a key figure in the theater of the absurd that sought to revolt against all stage conventions. His most famous work is Waiting for Godot in 1952. There's also the lack of characterization that portrays a world with helpless characters with no sense of identity. Also, there are no action or plot. that proves how a drama is possible without it, while keeping the audience entertained. His play has pessimistic themes with absurd symbolic language that deals with despair and the will to survive in an incomprehensible world.